Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We've been exploring some pretty fascinating figures from history recently, and today I thought, given your own deep faith, we could maybe dive into a period that was truly transformative, and for Catholics, profoundly painful, the English Reformation.
Oh, absolutely. I think that's a really good choice.
Yeah, and we were talking recently about Thomas Cromwell and his surprising last-minute declaration that he was Catholic right before, his execution.
Yeah, quite a twist.
It really makes you think, right? Like, what exactly did he oversee during all those years in power? I mean, what actions were really so devastating from a Catholic perspective? What was it that really paved the way for Henry VIII's radical break from Rome and all the turmoil that followed?
That's the question, isn't it? And I think it's a perfect starting point for our discussion today because under Henry VIII, Thomas Cromwell he was the architect. I mean, he was the one who shaped the policies that they reshaped the religious landscape of England, and the consequences for the church and its faithful were, catastrophic for a Catholic standpoint.
So in this deep dive, we're going to trace the key events. We'll look at the impact of the dissolution of the monasteries, the confiscation of all those church properties. I'm talking about everything from the grand cathedrals down to local parishes and even the sacred objects. We'll see how religious orders that had been around for centuries just scattered, and then the incredible courage of those who chose martyrdom rather than betray their faith. And ultimately, we'll uncover those lasting scars, both spiritual and political, left by this whole era. And, it's so important to remember we're approaching this history through the lens of a devout Catholic, using historical accounts that truly reflect that deep, heartfelt perspective. So before we get into the specifics, paint a picture for me. What was life like, spiritually and religiously, for Catholics before Henry started dismantling everything?
Okay, so imagine England before all this turmoil. It was deeply embedded, truly woven into the fabric of European Christendom. It was a land rich with monasteries. These were centers of learning, often connected to religious orders. It was a land that had produced so many saints and had shrines, revered shrines, that drew pilgrims from all over. In fact, they even called it Our Lady's Dowry, a title that speaks volumes about their deep and long-standing devotion to Mary, the Blessed Virgin Mary.
Our Lady's Dowry. That really emphasizes the spiritual character of the nation. And how did this deep faith, how did it manifest in the everyday lives of people?
It was a sacramental rhythm, really, centered on the Holy Mass, regular confession, and pilgrimages. The church wasn't just for Sundays. It was woven into the fabric of their existence. It was there for births, marriages, deaths. It was there for spiritual subsistence throughout their lives.
And the monasteries, they played such a vital role in this deeply Catholic society, right? I mean, it wasn't just monks and quiet contemplation.
Absolutely. The monasteries were the heart of it all, really, both spiritual and social life. They were centers of learning, meticulously preserving ancient texts and fostering all sorts of intellectual pursuits. They provided hospitality to travelers, charity to the poor. They set up schools, hospitals. And beyond all that, they were communities dedicated to prayer day in and day out. Imagine their lives, a constant intercession for the world. The dissolution wasn't just about money. It severed centuries of this practice, this support. It altered the fabric of English life for Catholics.
A true cornerstone, then, both in a spiritual and a practical sense. And then along comes Henry VIII, with his desire for a male heir. How did this personal ambition begin to unravel this deep-seated religious order?
It was the driving force, really. Henry's desire for a male heir was intense. He wanted to secure the Tudor dynasty. But after nearly 20 years with Catherine of Aragon, they only had Mary, and she was a daughter. So Henry became convinced that the marriage was cursed. He needed an annulment. He had to remarry to produce, a male successor.
And the Pope, Clement VII, he refused to grant that annulment.
It was a tough spot for Clement. Canon law, you see, upholds the indissolubility of marriage. And then he was also under political pressure from Catherine's nephew, Emperor Charles V. Talk about powerful. So he couldn't grant the annulment. He wouldn't. And this ignited Henry's resentment towards papal authority.
This is where Thomas Cromwell and Anne Boleyn come into the picture. How did they accelerate this whole break from Rome?
Oh, they were pivotal, both of them. Anne, she was the one Henry was set on marrying, but she refused to be just a mistress. And Cromwell, well, he was a shrewd strateger. He saw a chance to consolidate royal power, directly challenging the Pope within England. Both of them, they pushed Henry to assert control over the church.
And that leads us to the 1534 Act of Supremacy, a truly revolutionary moment. What exactly did this decree entail?
It was seismic. The Act of Supremacy declared Henry VIII and all future English monarchs the supreme head of the Church of England. So basically, they replaced the Pope as the ultimate authority. All religious matters, now under the king. Spiritual authority, gone from the papacy, handed right to the crown. It ushered in this idea of a national church where the ruler holds spiritual jurisdiction. To many devout Catholics, it was a new church without Christ's victor.
A dramatic redefinition of power. And what were the practical consequences? Especially for the clergy.
Immediate and far-reaching. All priests and bishops, they had to swear an oath of loyalty, not just to the king as the head of state, but as the head of the church, putting the king's authority above the pope's, even in matters of faith. Those bishops who refused, they were deposed. Some, like St. John Fisher, even executed for their defiance. And any Catholic refusing this oath, they were branded traitors, not for rebellion against the state, but for their fidelity to their faith and the pope. Being Catholic was now treason.
Adhering to the core of their faith, punishable by death. A terrifying reality. And we see early examples of resistance with St. John Fisher and St. Thomas More.
Yes, St. John Fisher, the Bishop of Rochester, he was the only bishop in all of England who refused to take that oath of supremacy. And then there's St. Thomas More, the former Lord Chancellor, a man of immense integrity. He refused to acknowledge Henry as the head of the church. Their resistance, rooted in their Catholic faith, led to their imprisonment and ultimately their martyrdom in 1535. It wasn't just defiance, it was a choice of eternal fidelity over temporal obedience, a core tenet of Catholic belief. They were among the first to pay the ultimate price for their loyalty to the church.
Unwavering courage in the face of absolute power, a true testament to their faith. But the assault didn't stop there. We then had the dissolution of the monasteries, largely orchestrated by Cromwell. What was the official justification for this?
Well, Cromwell was quite skillful in how he presented it. He framed it as reform, a necessary measure to, clean up the monastic system. Royal commissioners, they were sent out all across England. Their job was to visit and inspect the monasteries, assess their condition, identify any abuses or mismanagement, corruption, that sort of thing. This was all under the authority of the Valor Ecclesiasticus, a comprehensive survey meant to assess, well, the wealth and income of the monasteries, sort of a precursor to their dissolution.
But the true motivation was something else entirely, wasn't it? The wealth, the land held by the monasteries, it must have been a huge factor.
Oh, absolutely. The underlying intention was to dismantle these houses. They were seen as bastions of loyalty to Rome, and of course they held a lot of land and wealth. The reports from these commissioners, they were often falsified, filled with exaggerated accusations, vice, idleness, corruption. While it's true that some individual houses might have had issues, the vast majority, they were centers of piety, learning, charity. The accusations were just a pretext to grab their assets and cut their ties to Rome.
Baseless accusations, then, used to justify a predetermined outcome. What is the first stage in this dissolution?
It began in 1556. They targeted the smaller monasteries, those with an annual income of less than £200. Over 300 of them were dissolved just like that. The monks, the nuns, many who had taken lifelong vows dedicated to God, to prayer, they were forced out. Some were offered small pensions, the chance to transfer to larger monasteries, but many, well, they were left destitute, heartbroken, and some even imprisoned for resisting. They had to abandon their sacred vocations.
An unimaginable upheaval, not just for those in religious life, but for all those who relied on their support. And then the focus shifted to the larger abbeys.
Yeah, from about 1538 to 1541, the great abbeys, places like Glastonbury, Fountains, Rievaulx, Walsingham, they were all targeted and suppressed. Imagine, sacred relics, some dating back centuries, venerated by the faithful, they were seized, burned in public, or just sold off. Titless manuscripts, ancient books, destroyed, scattered. Vestments, liturgical items, gone. Even the bells that called people to prayer for generations, melted down, often to be recast as canons. Altars desiccated and destroyed. It was a violent break with the past.
The pilgrimage sites, so central to the faith, they weren't spared either, were they?
No, they were desecrated, demolished. Walsingham, the most significant Marian shrine in England, razed to the ground. The statue of Our Lady of Walsingham taken to Chelsea and burned. It was a direct assault on popular piety, on traditions held dear.
The sense of loss, the outrage, it must have been immense. Was there any resistance to this?
Oh, there was. From the monks, the nuns, of course, they were losing everything. And from lay people who understood the importance of the monasteries. The most significant uprising was the Pilgrimage of Grace in 1536, a huge rebellion in the north of England. They demanded the restoration of the monasteries, the freedom of the church, but it was crushed. Many who participated, including abbots and priors who defended their communities, they were arrested, executed.
So not only the destruction of sacred spaces, but the silencing of those who defended them. What were the wider spiritual consequences of losing these monasteries?
The devastation was immense. The monasteries were powerhouses of prayer. Their suppression silenced centuries of contemplative life, a deep wound to the soul of England. And we can't forget their role in caring for the poor, the sick, offering hospitality, education. Their closure left a gaping hole. No system in place to replace their charitable works. It disrupted the very fabric of life for Catholics.
Following the dissolution, we see this widespread confiscation of church property, extending far beyond just the monastic holdings, a truly sweeping seizure.
Yes, it went far beyond the monasteries. From a Catholic perspective, it was the systematic plundering of the Bride of Christ. The crown, under Henry and guided by Cromwell, seized not just the lands and buildings of the monasteries, but also their treasures. Liturgical vessels, relics, consecrated items, all either melted down or sold for profit.
And this immense wealth, it wasn't kept by the crown, was it? It was redistributed with long-lasting consequences.
Exactly. A large portion of these lands and estates was given to nobles, individuals loyal to Henry and his new religious order. It enriched them and secured their support for the break from Rome. And simultaneously, it led to the secularization of spaces that had been sacred for centuries.
So these sacred spaces were not only taken, but often treated with disrespect.
Sadly, yes, there was widespread desecration. Churches, some ancient, some deeply significant for local communities, were stripped of their ornamentation, some even demolished. Holy relics publicly burned, a calculated rejection of the old faith. Even national shrines, like St. Thomas Becket's at Canterbury, were destroyed, their memory erased.
And this had a real human cost, particularly for the most vulnerable.
Absolutely. The monasteries had been vital centers of charity. When they closed, the system of support vanished. Destitution and vagrancy increased dramatically. Acts of mercy, if done out of loyalty to the Catholic Church, became suspect, even criminalized. It was a stark shift from a society where charity was central to one where the state asserted control, leaving many desperate and without support.
A systematic dismantling of Catholic England, leaving behind a landscape scarred by sacrilege. And amidst this upheaval, there were those who stood firm, those we call the martyrs of the crown. Let's start with St. John Fisher. Who was he and what led him to resist the king?
St. John Fisher, born in 1469, was a brilliant scholar, deeply pious. He was the Bishop of Rochester, known for defending the faith even before Henry's break with Rome. He even debated early Protestant reformers, his act of defiance. He refused to take the oath of supremacy, the oath declaring Henry as the supreme head of the Church of England. He believed the Pope, as the successor of St. Peter, was the true head of the Church.
And the consequences for that were severe.
Indeed. He was imprisoned in the Tower of London for over a year. He was old, his health declining, but he remained steadfast in his refusal to acknowledge the king's spiritual authority.
Inspiring courage. And even in prison, his defiance resonated. There was that symbolic act from Rome.
Yes, Pope Paul III made Fisher a cardinal while he was still in the Tower. Henry was furious. He said Fisher would never wear that red hat in England. It solidified his desire to punish Fisher.
So his martyrdom was a direct response to that act of papal support.
It certainly fueled Henry's anger. On June 22, 1535, Fisher was beheaded. His last words affirmed his loyalty to the Church and the Pope. His head was displayed on London Bridge, a warning to others.
A brutal end. What's his legacy for Catholics?
St. John Fisher is a symbol of apostolic courage, a bishop who remained faithful even under threat of death. He's a patron saint of bishops, theologians, all those who defend the faith.
And then there's St. Thomas More. We touched on his resistance earlier. What makes his story so compelling?
Thomas More, born in 1478, was an incredible figure. Renowned lawyer, humanist scholar, he even served as Lord Chancellor, but he was also a man of profound Catholic faith. It shaped his entire life.
He was close to Henry initially, right? But their relationship fractured over these religious issues.
They had a close bond based on respect. But More's faith, his belief in papal supremacy, prevented him from supporting Henry's actions. He resigned as chancellor rather than participate in something he believed would undermine the Church.
So his refusal to compromise on papal supremacy was central to his resistance.
Absolutely. He tried to resist silently, not speaking out against Henry, but also not endorsing him. But this wasn't enough. He was imprisoned for refusing the oath of succession, which acknowledged Henry's marriage to Anne Boleyn and his role as head of the church.
And despite imprisonment and pressure, he held firm to his beliefs.
For over a year, he faced pressure from officials, even his family. His trial was unjust, based on lies. But More defended himself, proclaiming his belief in the Pope's authority and the sanctity of his own conscience.
His final words are famous, aren't they?
Yes. On July 6, 1535, before his execution, he said, "I die the king's good servant, but God's first." It perfectly captures his understanding of earthly duty and his ultimate allegiance to God and the Church. His head, like Fisher's, was displayed on London Bridge.
A powerful statement of priorities. What's his legacy?
St. Thomas More is the model of lay holiness, a man of integrity, courage, and fidelity, the patron saint of statesmen, politicians, lawyers, a reminder that faith and conscience must come first.
We also have Blessed Richard Whiting, the abbot of Glastonbury Abbey. Tell us about his stand and his fate.
Blessed Richard Whiting, born around 1461, was abbot of Glastonbury, one of the most ancient and revered Christian sites in England. It had traditions stretching back to the earliest days of Christianity in Britain. He was known for his polity, leadership, and charity.
Glastonbury was a special place, wasn't it?
It was steeped in tradition and legend, believed by many to be founded by Joseph of Arimathea, connected to King Arthur. For centuries, a center of pilgrimage, devotion to Mary. Abbot Whiting initially tried to comply with some reforms, hoping to preserve the abbey, but when the king's men arrived demanding its surrender, he refused.
He drew a line when it came to the very existence of his abbey.
He understood Glastonbury's significance. It wasn't the king's to dispose of, it belonged to God and the faithful. For this act of defiance, he was arrested in 1539, imprisoned in the Tower, and condemned to death without a trial.
A complete disregard for justice. What happened to him?
On November 15, 1539, Abbot Whiting, along with two monks, Roger James and John Thorne, were martyred on Glastonbury Tor. They were hanged, drawn, and quartered, a horrific death meant to terrify those who resisted. Glastonbury Abbey was left to ruin, its shrine desecrated.
A tragic end to a sacred place and its leader. How is he remembered?
Blessed Richard Whiting is a symbol of resistance against the destruction of monastic life. He's seen as the spiritual father of English monasticism during that time. He was beatified, recognizing his martyrdom.
These stories illustrate the suffering faced by Catholics. And as we discussed, the places of worship were transformed. What happened to the cathedrals, parish churches, and chapels?
It's essential to remember that every single one of those buildings belonged to the Catholic Church. Built, endowed, maintained for centuries by the faithful. When Henry declared himself supreme head, they were seized by the crown. Bishops loyal to Rome were deposed, replaced with those who submitted to the king. The cathedrals from Canterbury to York were stripped of their Catholic character. Altars replaced, shrines destroyed, the Latin Mass banned.
So Catholic worship was eradicated, replaced by something dictated by the king. And what about the local parish churches?
Tens of thousands of them were confiscated, forced to conform. Priests loyal to Rome were punished, replaced by those loyal to the king. Altars removed, statues destroyed, confessionals dismantled. The Mass, the heart of Catholic life, was banned under penalty of death.
A complete overhaul of Catholic practice. What about the sacred objects, the very architecture of these churches?
Chalices, monstrances, reliquaries, vestments, all confiscated, sold, melted down, or destroyed. The very architecture was violated, with later alterations erasing even more of their Catholic heritage.
From a Catholic viewpoint, how are these buildings seen today?
They remain sacred, consecrated for the worship of God. Their seizure and use by others can't erase that. Sadly, even after Catholic emancipation, very few were returned. They remain symbols of a painful division.
The Reformation also impacted religious orders, communities integral to English life. They were scattered, weren't they?
Yes, virtually all Catholic orders were suppressed. Their monasteries and convents closed, property seized, members had to abandon their vows or flee into exile.
Which orders were most affected?
The Benedictines, with their great abbeys, were decimated. Many monks imprisoned or martyred. Those who escaped founded communities abroad like Dry. The Cistercians were also suppressed, though they later returned. The Carthusians faced brutal persecution, with many, including St. John Harton, martyred. The Franciscans, Dominicans, and Augustinians all saw their communities dissolved.
A devastating blow. Were there efforts to preserve these traditions?
Many Catholics kept their faith in secret, and some orders re-established themselves in exile. The English Benedictines, for example, founded monasteries abroad, educating English Catholics and training priests who had returned to England. Later, the Jesuits, new to England, became crucial, sending missionaries like St. Edmund Campion and St. Robert Southwell. The scattering was a loss, but it shows the resilience of English Catholics.
And that resilience came at a cost. What about the broader picture of martyrdom and persecution?
The price of faith was immense. Estimates of Catholics martyred range from hundreds to thousands. The Church recognizes over 400 English and Welsh martyrs, including St. John Fisher, St. Thomas More, St. Edmund Campion, St. Margaret Clitheroe, and St. Anne Line.
And those are just the ones we know by name.
Hundreds of priests were martyred for being priests or celebrating Mass. Many trained abroad and returned knowing the risks. Lay Catholics were also martyred for refusing the oath of supremacy, sheltering priests, attending Mass, or not attending Anglican services. Estimates of executions range from 400 to 800, but the true number could be higher, considering those who died in prison or from torture. Pope John Paul II's beatification of the 85 martyrs of England and Wales highlights this suffering. From a Catholic perspective, these were sacrifices, witnesses to the faith.
The scale of the property confiscation must have been staggering. What was the financial impact?
It was one of the largest transfers of wealth in European history. Monastic lands and properties were worth between 1.3 and 1.8 million pounds then, billions today. Their annual income was about £150,000, 10 times the king's income.
What exactly was seized?
Over 2 million acres of land, estates, buildings, sacred treasures, pilgrim offerings. Everything was taken.
And what happened to all that wealth?
It funded Henry's court and wars and bought the loyalty of nobles. But much of it was wasted. The consequences were profound. A new aristocracy emerged, enriched by what Catholics saw as sacrilege. The Church, meanwhile, was left impoverished, stripped of its resources. A spiritual and material catastrophe.
Finally, let's discuss the Church leadership. St. John Fisher resisted, but what about the other bishops?
At the time of the break with Rome, there were about 18 bishops. Only Fisher refused the oath of supremacy. He lamented the silence of his fellow bishops.
So the majority conformed.
Yes, the other 17 bishops submitted to Henry. Some may have had reservations, but none joined Fisher's resistance. Some kept their positions, others were even promoted. This contrasts sharply with Elizabeth I's reign, when all 14 remaining Catholic bishops refused a similar oath and were deposed.
A striking difference. How is the bishop's conformity under Henry viewed by Catholics?
It was a huge disappointment, a scandal, a failure of leadership. The contrast with the bishops under Elizabeth I, who chose imprisonment and death over compromise, only highlights this. It speaks to the pressure and fear they were under, but it also raises questions about their courage.
This has been a deep dive into a painful period. We've seen the loss of religious life, the desecration of sacred spaces, the scattering of orders, and the witness of martyrs.
It was a deep wound in the history of the Church in England, a break with a long Catholic heritage.
So as we conclude, a thought for you, our listener. The English martyrs sacrificed everything for their faith. What can we learn from them about faith and power? What does it mean to stay true to your beliefs, even when facing opposition? We invite you to reflect on these questions and to keep exploring this crucial period in church history. Thank you for joining us.